The Gospel of John is one of the most profound writings we find in the New Testament. But when we examine it closely, something surprisingly appears. The story seems so carefully constructed, almost really like a drama, with signs and symbolic statements and conversations that really seem to follow a very deliberate pattern. So, an important question arises, doesn't it? Are we reading a simple eyewitness account, or are we reading a carefully crafted theological narrative? Now, what we're going to do to get this episode started is to analyze some particular expressions the writer of this gospel uses and what conclusions can be drawn from them. So, let's take the first one. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Son of God did not normally mean a divine being. It was a royal or sort of covenant title. For example, God says to David regarding to Samuel, the future king, 2 Samuel 7 and verse 14, I will be his father, and he will be my son. And then similarly, in the second psalm, God says to the king this time, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So here, son means God's chosen ruler, God's appointed representative, if you like, the anointed king, the Messiah. So, in Jewish thought, Son of God really equates to the Messiah, chosen by God. Quite simple. And this, of course, fits perfectly with the statement we find in John chapter 20 and verse 31, which reads, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So, when characters in the gospel confess Jesus as the Son of God, they usually mean Messiah, not some metaphysical deity, if you like. Let's take an example. See, when Nathanael, when he meets Jesus, he says in John chapter 1 and verse 49, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Notice the parallel of these two titles, the Son of God and the King of Israel. They essentially are synonymous, aren't they? Again, when Martha of Bethany, when she speaks to Jesus, John chapter 11 and verse 27, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God. See, once again, what are we seeing? We are seeing Christ, or Messiah, equates really to the Son of God. However, in the wider Greco-Roman world, the phrase Son of God could mean something quite different. Let's take an example. There are figures such as the heroes or emperors. Now, they were sometimes described this way. For example, let's take the Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar. He was called Divi Filius, son of the divine. Now, in that cultural context, the phrase could suggest a sort of semi-divine figure, sort of a demigod. So the same words could carry sort of two different conceptual meanings. Now, why does this matter as far as the gospel is concerned, John's gospel? Well, if this gospel was written in a Hellenistic environment, such as would have been in the city of Ephesus, for example, which many believe it was, the author may have been aware that these two meanings, they actually did exist. And so the narrative can sometimes appear to speak on two levels. The first one, Jewish messianic language, or Hellenistic philosophical sort of interpretation of it. Now, this may be why the Logos language appears in the prologue, those first 18 verses, while the narrative, the rest of the gospel, the scenes themselves, they often use messianic language. And we're going to see that as we go through. And so this brings us back to the obvious sort of tension between the theological language of John chapter 1 and verse 1, right through to 18, to the simpler statement of purpose in John chapter 20 and verse 31, which we've just read. So we have a real sort of literary contrast here, don't we? See, the gospel, well, it appears to be doing sort of two things at the same time. Narrating the ministry of Jesus, while also interpreting his significance for a more broader Greco-Roman audience. Because this is the one they've come to regard as the Christ. So, what we find, of course, is that inside the gospel, Jesus most often uses a different title for himself, and that is Son of Man. 12 times it appears. Now we're going to mention this. Chapter 1 and verse 51, chapter 3 and verse 13, chapter 3 and verse 14, chapter 5 and verse 27, chapter 9 and verse 27, chapter 9 and verse 35, chapter 12 and verse 23, chapter 12 and verse 34, and then chapter 13 and verse 31. Now, why have I given all those details? Well, really, you need to check them yourself, just to make sure that I'm not spinning you some tale. Go and check those verses and see what I mean. Now, let's come to another expression about Jesus as the Word of God. Well, there are a few places in the New Testament where logos or word appears. However, these occurrences are limited to the writings which are traditionally attributed to John or those associated with him. For example, Revelation chapter 19 and verse 13, it explicitly identifies Jesus as the Word of God. We read, "He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God." Now, I hope I'm not going to mangle this in Greek, but it's hologos to theo. And this, of course, echoes John chapter 1 and verse 1, and also verse 14, where let's remind ourselves, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, there is also a rather oblique reference in the first letter of John, chapter 1 and verse 1, where we read, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have gazed upon and touched with our own hands, this is the word of life. Now, these are the only uses of the word outside of the Gospel of John. Now, I can emphasize that. Really emphasize that it does not appear in the other New Testament books. And we can go to Mark, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul's letters, Hebrews, or the other letters. They do not use this title for Jesus in the same sort of personal, divine sense. So, what are we to make of this gospel? Now, my personal assessment, and that's all it is, my personal assessment, is that the events described in the gospel, well, they did indeed likely come from the aged Apostle John. However, the narrative that's built around those events is the product of a writer whose purpose was to Hellenize the theology, reflecting, of course, the changing times and, of course, the audience, the Greco-Roman audience. Now, in previous videos, Series 2 in particular, we examined the internal chronology of this gospel, and we found it wanting in many ways. And also, as we have examined in parts 1 and 2 of this series, a carefully created structure begins to emerge. See, in the comparison with the Euripides play, there appears to be, well, a putting together of a theological framework with really serious Hellenistic undertones. However, the problem with trying to sort of develop a narrative around the theology becomes very obvious when we consider the data within the narrative, what the narrative itself presents. You know, we see the internal contradictions in a careful analysis. And that's what we saw in Series 2, where I presented some 6 videos on this subject, right? And we saw that the internal chronology was demonstrated to be really extremely problematic. Now, you can recap by going back, through those series when you can make some time to check. And I'll put these links in a separate page in the credits of this video, so you can go back and check it for yourself. See, the first 2 are worth starting with in any investigation. Series 2 and Episode 1, was Jesus' ministry 3.5 years? What do the Gospels reveal? Then the second one, Episode 3, how long was Jesus' ministry? 1 year or 3 years? And it's explained. Then the next 2, they pertain to John chapter 5. Series 2, Episode 4, the ministry of Jesus. What was going on in John chapter 5? And then we have the next episode, Episode 5, is Eusebius and his reason for his take on the 3.5-year ministry. And then finally, the last 2 videos, well, they show really the chronological inconsistencies in chapter 6. Series 2, Episode 6, which what about John chapter 6 and verse 4? And then we go to Episode 7, John chapter 6 and verse 4, debunked, the missing Passover, and Jesus' true ministry timeline. Now, I'll put them in the credits, and I would encourage you not to just take my word for it. That's definitely not recommended. You have to be confident that by checking the actual data in those videos for yourself, you can be certain of what you believe or what I'm telling you. Now, there is another literary device the writer uses to connect the first 18 verses of the Gospel, the so-called I am statements. There are 7 of them. John chapter 6 and verse 35, I am the bread of life. John chapter 8 and verse 12, I am the light of the world. John chapter 10 and verse 7, I am the door. John chapter 10 and verse 11, I am the good shepherd. John chapter 11 and verse 25, I am the resurrection and life. John chapter 14, I am the way, the truth and the life. And John 15 verse 1, I am the true vine. Now remember, we have covered 7 signs or miracles in this series, right? However, in Jesus' prayer, John chapter 17, we find it there, he has 7 petitions. It appears that 7 is a symbolic number in the gospel, often sort of, indicating a completeness or perfection. However, in Greco-Roman culture, the number 7 was considered a sacred number and was associated with, for example, the 7 known planets at that time. The 7 days of the week still works. 7 wonders of the world. Apollo's birthday on the 7th day, that's around May, June in the ancient Greek calendars. So finally, before we move on to conclude this episode, there is just one more little point to mention. See, many scholars, perhaps even a majority indeed, feel that chapter 21 of this gospel, the last chapter, is an insertion early in the gospel account. It was put in after the account was made or written. And the reason is that when we read chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31, well, they feel very much like a sort of a natural ending to the gospel. Let's just check that. John chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in his presence, in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, that does appear to be a natural ending, doesn't it? However, all known manuscripts do contain chapter 21. So it seems that this insertion, chapter 21, may have been made quite early, before the manuscripts began to circulate much, shortly after, in fact, the gospel was written. So I ask the question again, what are we to make of this gospel's narrative? Well, let's pause and consider by returning to the beginning. Because now that we have followed the gospel through its signs, its teachings, its stated purpose, along with the recapping of Series 5 and Episode 2, the Gospel of John the Messiah, or something more, which, in the last video. Well, let's return to where it began. See, the narrative has shown that Jesus, let's put it this way, the narrative has shown that Jesus' actions, his teachings, his healings, his challenging, and of course, his revealing. And the gospel itself tells us why these things were written. John chapter 20 and verse 30, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. See, that statement is clear, it's direct, and it's rooted in the language of the Hebrew scriptures. But of course, the opening of the gospel speaks in a very different way. John chapter 1 and those first 18 verses, it introduces the word in language that is really reflective and sort of universal in scope. So, we are faced with an important question. Is this how the original witnesses understood Jesus? Or are these opening words, those first 18 verses, are they expressing the significance of his life in a different kind of language? In other words, are we reading the message itself or an interpretation of the message more sort of conducive to a Greco-Roman culture? Now, does the text resolve that question for us? Well, that depends on how we wish to read it. See, there are two words which come to mind when we examine something. The first word is eisegesis. Now, this is the process of interpreting a text in such a way as to introduce one's own presupposition or agendas or biases into the understanding. And this is commonly referred to as reading into a text. And it's often done to justify or confirm a position which is already held. Then the other word is exegesis. And this is really an explanation of a text, especially after its careful study, allowing, in other words, the text to explain itself to us. So by reading the gospel carefully from beginning to the end, we are now able to see the distinction. And it is that distinction which really invites us to consider very, very carefully what it is we are being asked to believe. Therefore, in the next episode, which will be episode 5, we're going to carefully examine John chapter 1 and verse 1, and in particular asking the question, do our English translations of John's Gospel reflect the Greek text itself? So that's what we're going to be looking to. All right, so for the moment then, thank you very much once again for watching, and see you next time.